Europe is still looking for ways, aside from whatever happens with the United States, that they still want to be able to provide security guarantees for Ukraine. That's still on the top of the agenda. You know, this whole coalition of the willing thing, Russia has been adamant, categorical, point blank. There will be no agreement from the Russian side to any peacekeepers, any assurance forces, whatever title you want to put on them, inside of Ukraine as part of this settlement. And yet they still keep talking about it. From the European perspective, who is going to actually provide security guarantees, i.e. they'll fight for Ukraine?
Well, I think the any security guarantee that the Europeans offer is meaningless, because unless you have the military force to back it up, it's meaningless. So the idea of it being a guarantee is a fairly ridiculous idea. I'm sad to say that this coalition of the winning phrase has sort of caught on after about the last sort of 3 to 4 months. But as you and I know, it's a phrase that we've used in the military for decades, just to describe something that isn't NATO or isn't within a normal structure. But what it actually is at the moment in Europe, it's a coalition of the weak, not a coalition of the willing.
Oh, it's a better.
So the idea that the Europeans can provide security guarantees, it would have been almost impossible, I think, Danny, for the Americans to provide security guarantees in Russia, because of the geopolitical situation. It's a long way away from America, and there isn't the political consensus in America to do that, because essentially it means taking on the Russians.
Right.
So the idea that the Europeans can do it is fanciful. I think it'll drop away. I think it'll drop away because I suspect that as we get closer to some sort of settlement, that what will happen is that the Russians will make it clear to the Americans, and through Witkoff probably, that actually if the Europeans deploy any peacekeepers, in inverted commas, into Ukraine without their absolute say-so, and they certainly won't go under a NATO banner, that they will be attacked. I mean, from the sound of it, peacekeepers, or not peacekeepers, but NATO troops from the nations we know not whom were actually amongst the targets in the Sumy attack. And that surely is illustration that the Russians won't hesitate to attack. In fact, I hate to say this about troops from Europe, but my great worry is that actually if we do deploy them, that the Russians will attack with intent, because they'll want to again show the Europeans that they mean what they say. They've already done it once, because they said actually that this is a war which this is a expansion of NATO up with which we will not put, and they've shown that by the invasion. So if there's an opportunity to attack and kill European soldiers or Marines or sailors or airmen, then I think that in NATO, in Ukraine, I think the Russians will take it. And like, you can't blame them. After all, NATO have been firing forces into mainland Russia. So the opportunity to have a go back, I think, would be welcome, I suspect, amongst the Russian public as well.
Yeah, and certainly among many of the Russian, I guess you call them hawks, some of the military men that I've seen on the various Telegram channels, etc., they actually would like the chance to do that and are secretly hoping that it comes. Obviously, I'm not in that camp. I want to see this on the diplomatic table before we ever get to that point. But going back to one of your countrymen here, former national security advisor, says he thinks that he also sounds his own frustration in terms of the situation going on right now, and says, we first got to get that ceasefire before we can do anything else.
We've had some threats from President Trump to Moscow about further sanctions if they don't support an unconditional ceasefire, which the Ukrainians are supporting. Russians still haven't got there. That attack on Sumy, which you've just reported on, terrible attack, lots of Ukrainian deaths, and yet President Trump used it to say the Ukrainians should never have started the war, which is a strange thing to say. So I think the Europeans and the Ukrainians will want to know, what is the American game plan if Russia continues to refuse to agree to a ceasefire, which is in a way the easiest and most limited step that you can ask of them before you get into serious negotiations on the substance of this conflict. So if they won't even do that, that's a pretty bad start.
Yeah, but why would Russia, as you said earlier in this episode, from a position of strength, agree to an unconditional ceasefire, which would benefit the Ukraine, the weaker side, far more than the Russians.
I completely agree, Danny. Kim Durak, I think he was the ambassador in America as well, so he knows America well. But I think he's wrong on 2 points. I think, firstly, he suggests that the way to do this in terms of steps, the first step is a ceasefire, then is to getting towards a long-term negotiated peace. Well, that's completely the reverse of what Lavrov and Putin have been saying for at least the last 2 years. They've been saying all the time that they're looking for not for a short-term ceasefire, although they, I think, to show willing, they accepted or went along with the energy and the Black Sea elements of a short-term ceasefire, but not on the mainland, you notice. But what they want to go for a long-term ceasefire where they can really understand and think that they've actually got something which is going to meet their national security objectives. Whereas a short-term ceasefire, why would they do that? I mean, it's obvious to you and me as military people that in their minds, and I think they're probably right as well, having heard the Europeans, that the Ukrainians will use that period to rearm and to restock. And why would you want to allow them to do that if they're on the back foot? It does nothing to support your position in Russia. And so much to actually reduce it. I don't think it would stop Russia winning, which it's on track to, but it would certainly hold them back, and it just makes no sense whatsoever. I think it's about time we really got to the bottom of what the Russians are seeking. It should not be that difficult because they've been telling us for 2 years.
Yeah, and you said there was two things from what he said there. That was the one on the ceasefire. What was the second one?
Oh yeah, good question. I might have lost myself there, Danny, but let me try. I think that I think it was a ceasefire. There was something. Oh, Trump. I think that what Kim Durak was suggesting was that Trump had more leverage over Russia than indeed he does, and that it was a bad start in the way that he'd started. I think the truth is that Witkoff is no doubt finding and feeding back to Trump, I suspect, that actually the Americans have very few cards in this game. They do have cards in a game, but it's not the game between Russia and America. It's the game between America on the one hand and the Europeans and Zelensky on the other hand. There he's got a lot of cards to play. So I think those cards in his situation, I'd be wanting to play them because I'd be looking at what I suspect will be a summer offensive where a bad situation suddenly becomes worse and it becomes even more difficult for him politically. So I'd be wanting to get to a situation where I've actually gone as far as I can with Russia, accepting their conditions. I play those back to the Europeans and the Ukrainians, and if they don't accept it, then you can, and with great honesty, blame it on them for not accepting the realities on the ground and colliding them, as you so eloquently say.
So let me try to, or let me ask this question. I want to say it was November the 17th of last year. The United States finally lifted the moratorium on our long-range missiles, ATACMS. There had been some Storm Shadow missiles had been used for a while up to that point. And there was some talk about maybe the German Taurus missiles, but I think Chancellor Scholz never gave that authorization. At least officially, there were some claims at some reason, but it was a small number. Well, there was a meeting in which the former National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, and I'm going to actually talk about this in a show this afternoon in more detail, but in that interview, he admitted that the long-range missiles that we allowed to use, strangely enough, didn't have an operational effect. It was pointless. I mean, I made that comment on the day the announcement was made. It's self-evidently out. You wouldn't have had to wait to see it because you understand how the dynamics work. But with all of that history, then this is more puzzling to me. If you can put that headline up there, the Germans are now with the new chancellor thinking, hey, maybe we should send our Taurus missiles now. And British said that they will support Germany sending Taurus missiles. Why would they do that now when we've already fully demonstrated that long-range missiles don't change the dynamic? All it would do is it will hit some things potentially, depending on Russia's electronic warfare and anti-aircraft or anti-missile capabilities. But if it gets through in some places, and you probably can find some, all it's going to do is make Russia madder. How does this help our side out?
To me, it obviously doesn't help our side out. I mean, and actually, I thought that it was a very risky thing to do in the first place by the French and the British. And I thought that actually knowing that there were British and French people in the command chain was extremely risky. And we were lucky to get away without a attack by Russia on British and French assets. And I think the same issue is the same one here. It will make, as you and I both know, it will make no significant difference on the battlefield whatsoever. I think it's in part due to Metz and his character. He's clearly, whether he's rabidly anti-Russian, I can't work out, but certainly he is not a sort of in the middle ground, which would be a much more sensible place for him to be. But I think it's a dangerous thing to do. It doesn't help our case. And indeed, I'd be curious to see what the Americans actually think of it. I think it was the Biden administration who actually turned it off previously, the use of storm shadows and the use of ATACMS. And I think that they turned it off because actually the Russians picked up the phone to the Americans. I think it was the Russian chief of the German staff picked up the phone to the Americans and said, we're not going to put up with this, and that the Americans in turn warned the British and the French to stop, which indeed they did. But no, I think it's got no chance of helping whatsoever, and it certainly won't help in what seems likely to me, or if it is, a summer offensive. There's no chance of helping the summer offensive. So all that we're doing with it is potentially extending the campaign by a little, a week or two. But much worse, we're making the diplomatic circumstances much more difficult. So the Europeans are making the diplomatic circumstances for the Americans much more difficult. No gain for the Americans, and it's not obvious to me what possible gain there could be for the Europeans. I do think, Danny, we could perhaps talk about this a little bit further, that one of the reasons is that they're being very badly advised. The politicians and senior officials are being very badly advised by their military staff. And we've seen that some of the advice coming out of our generals and admirals and air marshals is particularly poor. I mean, I listened to Caviogli's statement to Congress, where I was dumbfounded that he could talk in that way. And I've recently a former British deputy Supreme Allied Commander Europe wrote in one of our broadsheets saying that we would be at war with Russia in 2 years. I mean, it's this sort of extraordinarily, abjectly bad strategic analysis and strategic thinking, which is holding us back. I think that one of the problems is that being in the military, you have a certain reputation, and of course that's nice, but it sort of needs to be based, I like to think, on success.
Right, and capacity.
Yeah, the last time, if you think about it, the last time I can remember a British general had a success in what was close to a peer-to-peer conflict was back in the Falklands for us. And since then, if you take the last 25 years of this century, when has a British or American or French or German general been able to actually mark up a success with which you could then say, yeah, I'm prepared to accept the advice of this individual because of his success on the battlefield? I mean, for you guys, it was 1993. And again, they're very, very clear. I think it was the Weinberger Doctrine, I can't remember, but it was Powell Doctrine, where there were very clear limits set around how you would actually deploy forces. And it was because of those limits that America didn't go into in Iraq, which I think Margaret Thatcher was after they liberated Kuwait. Margaret Thatcher was surprised by that, but I think Bush the elder made the right decision.